My name is Jonathon Meades, and this series is called Even Further Abroad. It peels off the drab grey overcoat of preconception to reveal the lime green posing pouch of reality beneath. God is a fantastically successful invention. If ever there was an idea that had legs, this is one which has run and run.
God has been doted on since man, in his bewildered ignorance and reverential wonder, first conceived the notion that there must be some omniscient grease monkey who fitted all the parts together, and who now offers full warranty in exchange for songs, sacrifices, oblations and genuflection. But who, if he's shown dis, delivers famines, plagues, quakes, typhoons? This is not a sophisticated conceit, which is what accounts for its appeal to millions.
God is a universal solution, which is why it is suppressed by despots who characteristically aspire to God's position.
In the popular account of Darwinism, which denies God, God is successfully adapted, triumphantly evolved. God has seen off all comers, all the other myth systems and programs of superstition.
Its creator, man, has made sure of that. Man may have failed to register God's paternity, may have ducked the matter of who created the creator.
But, boy, has man not provided well for his adoptive father, and for his adoptive father's son, and for Mary's husband, the poor cuckold Joseph. God people have a weapon which accords with God's status. A weapon which, say, astrologers, aggressive frauds who talk crystal balls, rarely possess. A weapon which palmists and ufologists and tea leaf geeks never possess. God people have God's multitudinous houses as proof of God. An undeniable, if blatantly temporal proof of that which is exquisitely beyond objective validation.
They've got a gamut of architectural and decorative details which are exclusive to God. The hold that God once had was phenomenal, total. Churches are the physical manifestations of that hold, of the delusion of omnipresence. Churches, the buildings, cannot be denied.
The idea of the church in England was, till very recently, tied to the idea of the Church of England, the Church of Convenience, which was founded to sanction a king's polygamous lubricity and his bluebeard appetites, which is something we should bear in mind when its prelacy comes on strong about failings of the flesh and worldly wickedness. Its moral basis was then infirm, but its architectural basis was strong as the rock which is Peter's name.
Anglicanism annexed an incomparable store of churches, the bulk of which are in the several and overlapping pointed arch idioms called Gothic.
Here's the church, here's the steeple, open the doors and see all the people. Here's the church, here's the steeple, open the doors and see all the people. Here's the church, here's the steeple, open the doors and see all the people. Here's the church, here's the see all the people. Here's the church, here's the steeple, open the doors and see all the people. 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 Church, here's the steeple, open the doors and see all the people. Here's the church, here's the steeple, here's the church.
This is what a church looks like. The nave houses the congregation, if there is one, and the spire points towards the sky, which is where God lives, with his beard obfuscating his irate face. He lives in funny clothes, in climatic insouciance, and in defiance of gravity, which is a post-God discovery. Even during that hiatus between the Restoration and the Regency, when classicism and its several and overlapping idioms were predominant, the Church did not abandon the Gothic. The Gothic was, after all, its logo, its trademark.
It found ways of giving Baroque and classical structures a Gothic silhouette. It added vertical emphases in the form of spires. It created architectural mongrellism in the service of self-advertisement, which was more important than adherence to classical tenets.
And after that hiatus, the Church went mad. The orgy of church building which characterised Victoria's reign recreated the Middle Ages before her subjects' eyes.
God had excelled in the Middle Ages, the Gothic centuries. That was God's moment.
God is a Goth, which is not to make some frivolous equation between the grand idea and a biker's devotion to Black Sabbath. It is rather to suggest that the appetite for God is most wholly excited by the Gothic, which is conducive to pious reason,
in a way that other kinds of architecture are not.
Like a bat out of hell, I'll be gone when the morning comes. When the night is over, like a bat out of hell.
In its revised forms, the Gothic is formidably anachronistic.
It is manifestly pre-Enlightenment. It conjures up the Dark Ages.
It is fearsome, often crazed, often suggestive of architectural psychosis. It complements and heightens the mysteries, the terror, and the morbidity of the passion.
It is an agent of desecularization. It made schools, law courts and stations into quasi-religious buildings. We thank God for selective education.
Atheism possesses no architecture which is expressly constructed for its ends alone. It doesn't need it. Only a void can express a void. Still, had atheists built, they could have built at no more propitious a moment than during the middle years of this century, when architecture had broken with Western Christian precedent. Atheists, quite properly, didn't build.
The Church, amazingly, did.
The Gothic outlived Victoria and extended into the early 1930s.
Between then and the outbreak of the Second World War, a number of churches were built, most notably by N.F. Catchmail Day, in an idiosyncratic modernistic style, which borrowed from the primitive geometry of contemporary industrial structures. Good dog.
They were, however, merely swallows. Summer had to wait till after the war and after the Holocaust. If the Holocaust couldn't extinguish faith in God, nothing ever will. How could the Church build in the wake of that enormity? All too easily is the answer. The Church exists to create its future, not to concern itself with the crimes of the immediate past. Its job is to demonstrate through its buildings and utterances that it's a pedagogic force, a moral force, a cultural force, that it belongs to today. It is, consequently, acutely fashion conscious.
The first post-war architectural fashion derived from the Festival of Britain, which was the festival of borrowing from Scandinavia. The festival style was whimsical, airy, and short-lived. Post-war Britain was poor. Building was licensed. And by the time licenses were revoked, this stuff was out of fashion. Parish churches usually still are poor. They are forced into a conservationist stance by lack of money.
Thus they are valuable repositories of forgotten design crazes and half-baked ephemera which have elsewhere been excised or amended. Conventional wisdom has it that compromise produces banality. First-generation post-war churches fascinate because they are products of compromise, not despite that condition. They're gay and trashy and cheap-looking. They're informed by a skittish lack of earnest. But then, the old fearsome God had proved to be impotent in the face of systematic atrocity and industrialized annihilation. It was time for a revised version, for God the Unmighty, God the ever such a nice bloke, God the softy, God the timid. In these churches is discernible the first step on the road to the cheery new hell. The dedication should be to St. Cosy and St. Cardigan. Pulpits were stripped of pomp, and you might think of authority. This is not a box to thunder from. It might even have been designed to inhibit fulmination. The chummy church underestimated the appetite for its own product. It misunderstood its USP. That appetite has come to be satisfied by wobbly temples, nuthouse sects, fringe cults, worship shacks. The church got it wrong. It wasn't less mumbo-jumbo that its punters craved, but more. For all their stylistic variations, the churches of the 50s shared certain formal, invariable mannerisms. The detached campanile, a form it shared with fire stations, doubled as a spire, a vertical sign. The trademark was no more shunned than it had been in the 18th century. And interiors still comprised nave, choir, aisles, baptistry, and so on. The compromise was caused by the rendering of those spaces in a manner that was aesthetically admissible to architects who were ill at ease with retrospection, yet lacked the killer instinct to do away with the spaces themselves. The church art of those years also belongs to the school of hedged bets, trapped between personal expression and sacred propriety. When Coventry Cathedral was consecrated in 1962, it became a place of pilgrimage, though not necessarily of holy pilgrimage. It was a magnificent if tardy monument to the equivocal victory in the war that had cost the city its former cathedral. There is certainly equivocation in Epstein's sculpture by the entrance. St. Michael, the dedicatee, is above Lucifer, but Lucifer is merely down, not out. He's no more defeated than Germany was. We will be back to perform the economic miracles this time. Protruding from the shallow steps to the entrance is a viewing platform. A viewing platform? For a sculpture? Even before its interior is broached, the pilgrim is invited to behold this phoenix in the shape of a radiogram as an art gallery, as Basil Spence's museum of expressly commissioned works on sacred themes. The stained glass is glorious. The descending flock of coat hangers. Outsized bobbins. Exaggeratedly misproportioned and threateningly claustrophobic. Incised with the same script that was used on the dust cover of the New English Bible. Shh. Sorry. The whole is dominated by Graham Sutherland's tapestry. The whole is a tour de force, but a pre-modern tour de force. The accretion of works mimics that which might be found in a medieval cathedral built over a couple of hundred years. This is the last major church of an 800-year-old tradition. It may be a gallery, but at least it pretends to be a cathedral.
Excuse me, thank you. Excuse me. Sorry. Thank you.
The Second Vatican Council decreed in the early 1960s that all that was not essential, whatever that meant, was to be eliminated from new places of worship. And, not to be outdone, the Church of Convenience arrived at the same conclusion. They work in mysterious ways, these competing liturgical engineers. The churches were clearly coming into line with the entrenched architectural dogma of the period, which anathematized ornament. This was a prodigiously weird carry-on. It wasn't merely a case of churches sleeping with atheistical architects, but a betrothal, marriage, impregnation. It was as though the meat trade had commissioned its new abattoirs from vegans. What next? Dedications to St. Judas the Supergrass and St. Herod the Cleanser? It was not the patrons, but the artists who called the shots. The result was buildings which were exercises in pure form, student projects which, by some miracle, actually got built. Modernism regarded itself as more than a style. It was an ideology, a faith. So here was one faith, supposedly serving another, but in fact taking the opportunity to perpetuate itself, to prove itself a moral, pedagogic and cultural force. This was cuckooism on the grand scale. It was the glorious parasitism of confident art upon wavering religion. Save for the cross and the altar, this might be a lecture theatre. The tyranny of minimalism is total. God's playpen of the 50s was annihilated. In its stead came elemental shapes. God's bunker. God is our defender. God's wearing a cheap party crown, pretending to be king. Or is he a spaceman? God's penitent in his clansmanhood. This is the fiery redemptor, no doubt. The faithful had to work to convince themselves that they were attending a church at all. The new language of sanctity was a desperate Esperanto. Every church had its own idiom. There was no norm, no consensus. Pastiche and figuration were dirty words in the 60s. Where once everything had had to look like something else, now everything had to look like itself. Shape was the sole agent of representation. Apart from that, ecclesiastical modernism was unconstrained, especially by practical demands. God's house didn't need a bathroom. God, like the Queen, doesn't go to the bathroom. Johnny Architect was presented with what he has always longed for, carte blanche. The only rule was to forget what a church looked like. So when you find a building that looks like a church, you're very likely to discover that it's a canteen. This is the church which belongs to the same college. Chunky, curt, stubby, tough. It's tied to the earth. God is to be found in rocks, roots, mud, clods, clay.
This is muscular Christianity reinterpreted. It's as virile as 8 young men straining to lay an egg, which is a sort of miracle.
A concrete installation can resolve itself into a heavy crash-landed aircraft, into a shark, or a sailboat. What sort of God is summoned up by these coy hints? The church may fancy itself at the heart of the community, but it has a perverse way of showing it. It hardly reaches out. It is curled in upon itself, like a gastropod or fossil. Maybe this is a grudging acknowledgement that Christian worship is a hidden, occluded, almost secret business, and that only those in the know can find their way in.
The bewildering licence granted to architects was abetted by the reforming mood throughout the church.
The attempt to appeal to the modern world by coming into line with the modern world annulled the church's appeal, which is nothing if not pre-modern. This was just one of a series of own goals, which included the New English Bible, agnostic clergy, and vicars with electric guitars trying, and failing, to reclaim the best tunes.
The ascendancy of theatre in the round had not escaped the church's notice. Here was a device which might involve the congregation, a crudely material and literal device which assumes that physical proximity to the celebrant and to the host is somehow a guarantee of divine access. This interior may inspire awe, but that awe is more likely to be aesthetic rather than religious. It is spatially powerful, but then so are hangars and concert halls, and this could be a concert hall.
Efficacy as a church, rather than as an architectural conceit, derives as much from lack of ambiguity as from any particular spatial or iconic device. This could be nothing but a religious building. It may look east to temples and west to Las Vegas, but it is manifestly a church. It is not multi-purpose. It does not share its space.
This church makes it emphatically clear that though God may be an absentee landlord, his houses should not be let out to all comers with a good cause. The temporal is separate from the spiritual, no matter how worthy the temporal may be.
The last modern megachurch does not heed this lesson. Clifton Cathedral seems embarrassed to be a church.
It wants to be the National Theatre. Is it finished? An architecture which proclaimed itself as democratic was incapable of addressing the problem of a publicly visible hierarchy. No pomp, no majesty.
No proclamation that the celibate who occupies this throne claims to do so at God's behest. There is no modern vocabulary to embody such an ancient and anachronistic idea. Abstractions cannot be represented by abstract architecture. Abstractions require figurative metaphors, physical analogues, explanatory devices.
Baptism does not require that sort of architectural intercession because it is an idea which is made visibly manifest. The initiation by water is literal. This superstitious immersion may be primarily a social rite, but it's a social rite which is performed in churches and which swells attendances. Baptistries are thus the focus of churches which are otherwise hardly used.
Baptistries are commensurately richer, more detailed than the buildings which contain them. What a wealth of fascinating features. The dish of the day. Little ponds for koi carp or mixed exotics. A bath from a health hydro. A proposal for the survival of the new model church.
It should take its cue from lidos, spas, wells. It should think fountains, geysers, water sports. And as for its other assets, they should be stripped, sold off. This is not an outrageous proposition.
The only other vaguely religious ritual which is still widely adhered to is the funeral. This process has already been hived off to thanatologists working at the specialist dispatch centres called crematoria.
These are the true churches of today, places where fire is real, not connected to hell.
Crematoria are no more for those suffering egress than baptistries are for the mewling donkey. It is the witnesses whom crematoria must address. These are strange places, observed almost exclusively in emotional extremes. This may be dealt with architecturally in a homeopathic way. The momentous physical change that has afflicted the unknown client is confronted head-on by suggesting that the body will be swallowed, consumed in the building's fearful maw, transported to another state. This sort of in-your-face grief management may compound the offence caused by the sense of loss. It may heighten the indignity. What if grief demands less drastic treatment? On the edge of Edinburgh, in a landscape which is benign rather than Arcadian, Basil Spence endowed this chapel with dignity, gravity, earnest solemnity.
This is not a place to keen in. It's a work of humane architecture that's fit for its purpose, which is grief with propriety, bottled up British grief. It's a serious place.
It is capable of catalysing the illusion of transcendence, of acting as the inanimate agent of solace, like the plain best friend who's always around when she's needed. Most of all, it encourages reflection on the four last things: death, judgment, heaven, hell. And having reflected on them, this superstitious atheist has decided he's not going to be greedy. He'll be happy, thank you, with just one last thing. Let it stop at death. Hold the flame! I don't want to meet God. Not after what I've said about him.
Good stuff.